Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Back to Basics. We're up to episode number 5, and Brenton, in this one, we're going to be talking scoring, which we have spoken about already what the stats categories are, and as we can see in front of us right now, there is an awful lot of stat categories.
That's it. And look, these all become muscle memory once you've been doing the game for a while. But for the new coaches as well, this can be a bit of paralysis by analysis on what everything is. So take your time going through it on the NRL Fantasy website. It'll give you a breakdown of exactly how each player can accumulate points in NRL Fantasy.
Yeah, you nailed it on the head there. You're not going to learn all of these instantly, and nor do we expect you to. But if you want to go to the NRL Fantasy website, you'll be able to see all of these. But these are possible ways of scoring. How do we actually score weekly? And that's by our squad. So each week, our starting 13, which, if you remember in previous episodes, I erroneously had on the screen 3 edges and 2 mids. It's actually the other way around. Starting 13, 4 interchange players each week. There's 2 sets of exceptions. So our major buy rounds in rounds 12, 15, and 18, and minor buy rounds in 13, 16, and 19, where you only need a starting 13. So Brenton, effectively what that means is most rounds we have 18, some we have 14, but I mentioned there 13 plus 4, that equals 17. I'm saying 18. Where does that 18th score come from?
So your 18th basic player comes from what you call your captain. So you get to choose a captain every week, and whatever they score, you actually get the double their points. So let's say your captain is Nathan Cleary, which a lot of people will always have, and he scores 70, then you will get a total score of 140 based off him being your captain.
That's right, and we'll talk about in a few episodes later on around some strategy around your captaincy, but essentially, as Brenton said there, you get to double their score every single week. We also have an auto emergency included. We alluded to that in the lingo, but let's explore that a bit further here, Brenton. And I guess the main thing we want our coaches to understand here is that you only receive an auto emergency when one of your top 17, so that's your starting 13 or your bench, records it did not play. Unfortunately, if your guy scores a 0, it's bad luck.
That's right. So they have to be a do not play or not take the field. So basically what that means is that you're going to have someone in your 18 to 21 who can come up and take that place as long as you have filled the starting 13 to begin with. So that way, you have someone get injured in the warm-up and it's not something you could have foreseen and it's in the last game where you can't do anything about it. It gives you that bit of leeway to have another person's score come into your side.
That's right. So make sure you don't buy any players that are going to score zeros, because otherwise you'll need to delete that. But on the rules, you'll see quite a large amount of text that explains this, and we've just broken it down as simply as we possibly can as to when you get a player that does not play, what happens with your auto emergency. So with your bench, so we've got 4 players on our bench, and then we've got 4 what we call emergencies, or essentially non-scoring players. If one of your bench players does not play and records a did not play or a DNP, the next highest player on your bench will slide up into your 4 bench players and you'll get their score. If the player is in your starting 13, the first player on your bench that has the same position as that player that did not play will go effectively into the starting 13. And if that player was on your bench, so your first 4 scorers, then you would have someone slide up. And Brenton, I think this is a good point to emphasise. This is why we need some positional coverage on our bench, because if we have, say, Herbie Farnworth as one of our only 2 centres in our team, and he's out with a head knock or misses the bus and gets dropped by the coach, if we don't have a centre on our bench, we're only going to be playing with 16 that week.
Correct. And this is where squad depth is really, really important, as well as the DPPs or the dual position players, where they can cover multiple areas in case you have any of those injuries that come through.
Absolutely, and I'm looking forward to our next episode. Of course, we're actually going to touch on DPPs, but into this one, we want to go through the classes of players that we have. Now, Brenton, we went through them in the lingo episode just previously, but I guess for the newer coaches, what sort of price ranges would you classify each set of these players?
Yep. So for the guns, I would consider that being anything above this year's 700,000, which is normally your 51 and above scores. Mid-ranges, I'd class as 450 to 700, and then cash cows could be 450 and below, depending on. Actually, I'd probably say 400 to 700 for mid ranges, and then up to 400,000 for cash cows. because they don't have the higher averages and they don't need as much to start generating you money to then do your cash downs or your cash outs, what you need to do.
Absolutely, and obviously seeing Cam Munster in the mid-ranges is a bit strange. We'll talk about him in a subsequent episode, but as we started this episode, we spoke about there being a lot of stat categories, and I think probably the best way for coaches to learn how to identify good fantasy relevant players is understanding the difference between base stats for each position and non-base stats for each position.
That's right. And base stats is it's very, very simple. It's what you generally see on a rugby league field. So base stats would be tackles, run meters, kick meters, tries, goals. Or maybe not tries and goals, but those things that just are constantly happening throughout the entire game.
Yep, that's right. Because if you're a middle forward, you're probably going to make 30 odd tackles if you're on the field for a while. You might not score 30 tries though, or make 30 tackle busts, or kick 30, 40, 20s if you're a forward. So it's important to understand the base versus non-base. And essentially, Brenton, for most positions, looking at tackles, run meters is probably a good place to start.
Exactly right. So if you got, and that's why you generally try and find those positions like your mids or your halves because they have those base stats. So you can generally get an idea of what they call their floor is, and then if they end up putting in those non-base stats or attacking stats, then that's when you can work out what their ceiling is.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not all players are the same. Because we can see here net tackles, which essentially is the tackles minus any missed tackles, so because missed tackles are worth -2, and run meters for most of them. You throw the kick meters, maybe goals in there for halves or goal kickers, and then some specific players might also have other stat categories, because we know, Brenton, with the offload, where we've got offload to ground is worth 2 and offload to hand is worth 4, there are some middle forwards that are really prevalent in offloading the football, and then there's some others that are not so prevalent.
That's it, and that can also come down to the coach, I guess, because the coach might not allow them. Like a Craig Bellamy doesn't really like his forwards offloading, whereas you have guys like Jermaine Hopgood who is always looking for the offload. Junior Paulo is always looking for the offload. So that might be an area where you can try and target certain forwards who have a tendency for that.
That's right. And in terms of understanding the base stats of players, it's just about undertaking a bit of research, which we'll cover in a subsequent episode. But final concept we've got for the coaches in this one, Brenton, is points per minute or PPM. Now, generally not really going to be related to our 80-minute plays like our edges. Not our edges, our outside backs. But for our forwards, this stat can sometimes be very, very important.
Exactly right, and that's where you can find out who has the most impact. And then if they are, let's say they're a 35-minute player who's averaging 1 ppm or 1 point per minute, that means they're getting 35. All of a sudden, if they get an increased roll to 45 to 50 minutes, you can translate that points per minute into how many minutes they're getting now to get a bit of an idea about what you think their upside could be, and how if they can generate you some money as well.
Absolutely, and we'll talk about conducting research in a subsequent episode, but points per minute, good way to get around it. Very simple calculation, just their points by their minutes. But, Brenton, that wraps up this 5th episode. What are the key takeaways for the coaches?
Yep. So it's understanding essentially how your players are going to score per position from those base stats that we talked about. Understanding your points per minute, again, going for those either bench forwards or lower minute forwards who might be getting a bigger role at new clubs. And again, balancing that round one squad, you need to have different price players. You can't just afford to have 13 guns and then 8 cheapies, because as we know from previous years, that just doesn't seem to work. So you need to have a balance of that squad to try and make sure you nail that cash generation.
That's it. The cash generation is certainly something that we need to focus on. But that wraps up this 5th edition of Back to Basics. Be sure to join us for the next one where we talk about dual position players. But for now,